Hey you guys, it is me Laura with scrapsoфencouragement.com, and today I am going to be making cards inspired by the June 2019 paper pumpkin kit called A Little Smile. Now these were tiny cards that came and were meant for you to hand out and give to people that you see in your everyday life to bring them a smile, from a waiter to your hairdresser to your bank teller or just anyone you come in contact with. And it also came with a nice little carrying case to put the cards in when you were done. Now, Paper Pumpkin is a monthly subscription that comes for $22 a month. It gets delivered to your door, but if you aren't signed up by the 10th of the month, you miss out. So if you saw this kit and really love it and wanted to create some cards that are similar to this, then this is the video for you. So today we're going to be making some little cards that resemble the ones in the kit. There were several embellishments that came in the kit, from these sparkly sand dollars and starfish to the vellum coral. So today we're actually going to start by creating some embellishments that are similar to that, so that we can use them on all the cards as we go rather than creating them each time we go around. If you look in your catalog, there is a stamp set and a die set that go together perfectly that would really help you recreate this look. The stamp set is called Sea of Textures, and the coordinating dies are called the Under the Sea dies. The Under the Sea dies actually have sand dollar die cuts and coral die cuts that go perfectly with this kit. If you have these, that will make recreating these embellishments super easy for you. Unfortunately, I don't have those today, but that's okay. With just a little bit more work, we can still create wonderful elements to end up with cards that are really adorable. I am going to be using some elements from the Seaside Notions stamp set. I'll be using some of the seashells in this set as well as the little sand specks throughout this video, but this is really going to be my primary stamp set that I'm going to use to help me achieve these looks. So to start with, I'm going to use crumb cake ink, and I am just stamping a bunch of the sand dollar images onto some thick Whisper White cardstock. I'm using the thick cardstock because I want these elements to have some heft, some weight to them so that they'll hold up well. And since I don't have a starfish, I'm using one of the other shells that came in the stamp set instead. So I'm just going to stamp all of those out on my paper. Now, if you are using the dies that I showed you earlier and are using the sand dollar dies there, you could totally cover them with some of the shimmery white embossing powder, and that would look fantastic. But since I'm doing stamps, I didn't want to cover up all of the line work to show what the image was. So instead, I'm using my Wink of Stella glitter pen, and I am just coloring over these images. Now, I want these to be really sparkly like the ones in the kit, so after I paint over them once, I'm going back over them a second time to get them nice and sparkly. I'm not sure if you can see that on the camera if it picks it up, but these are pretty sparkly and that'll add a really fun element to the card. And now I'm just going to go through and cut them all out. The nice thing about this style of stamp is that it's not real precise, so my cutting doesn't have to be real precise either. But I am going to leave a little border around the edge of these sand dollars and the other shells as well. Once I have those cut out, I'm moving on to the coral. Now, I experimented with several different things for the coral here to find what worked. But I started by, I am stamping these in Versamark ink. This is a clear ink, but the problem that I find with vellum is that it takes a very long time for ink to dry on vellum. Typically, if I'm stamping on vellum, I will use something like StazOn. Now, what you can do to help that drying time is if you use clear embossing powder on top of it. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. So once I have them stamped, I'm just going to put my clear embossing powder on. And then I'm using my paintbrush to clean off any of the spots that kind of clumped up so that it looks nice and clean there. And when you are heat embossing vellum, you want to keep your heat gun moving because vellum will burn easier than regular paper. So just keep your heat gun moving, make sure it's really all the way hot before you bring it to your paper, and you should be good to go. Then I decided I wanted to try stamping these with some crumb cake ink and using the clear embossing powder on that. I wanted to color one of these because I feel like coral is usually pretty brightly colored, So I thought I would just turn my paper over after it's heat embossed, and I'm using my Stampin' Blends, my dark and light Calypso Coral Stampin' Blends, to color in the back of coral. And blending with these is a little different because the ink doesn't soak into the paper in the same way, but you kind of push the color around a little bit, but that's okay. You can still end up with something that looks really great. So then I just went around these to cut them out. Now, tried cutting these a number of different ways, and I found the best way worked to just kind of cut loosely around the outline. So I'm going to get these all cut out and ready to go. The last element that we'll be creating to replicate what came in the kit today is these little palm branches. Now, to create these, there are so many different punches and dies and stamps in the catalog that you can use. I'm using what I have, and I have the Dino Days stamp set in the coordinating Dino dies, and I am going to be using the palm branch stamp from that as well as the Dino die. So I'm going to stamp a bunch of these out using Old Olive ink, and I'm going to stamp it on Old Olive paper. And when I cut the dies out, I'm going to cut these out that have the pine boughs on them, and I'm also going to cut out just some plain solid boughs that don't have the stamped image on them. And that will give me a lot of options to work with as I work on these elements. Now that we have our elements ready, it is time to make some cards. So I decided to continue the small size of these cards, so I went with the small Memories and More card bases. It comes in a pack with large and small cards, and I'm using the small size cards. This card base will measure at 3 1/4 by 4 1/4 inches. They're a little bit larger than the ones in the kit, but I felt like they worked really well, and they come with matching envelopes. We're going to start with this palm tree card with the palm tree on the white wood background. And to get started, I am going to cut a piece of crumb cake cardstock at 4 1/4 by 1 1/2 inches. I'm also going to grab the sand texture stamp from the Seaside Notion stamp set, and I am going to do some second generation and some first generation stamping using my crumb cake ink. Now what I'm going to do is ink up my stamp, and then I'm going to stamp this texture directly on the paper, and then I'm going to stamp again right directly on the paper without re-inking. So this will give me a darker image and a lighter image, and I'm going to carry this kind of stamping all over the whole piece, and this is going to give me texture that makes it look a little bit more like sand. Once I've glued this panel down to my card base and chopped off any excess that was hanging over the edge, it is time to work on the white wood background. Now there's a stamp in the catalog that is perfect for this called the Birch background stamp. Since I don't have that stamp set, I'm going to get the wood grain effect by taking my crumb cake ink spot and running it in streaks down along my paper. Now I used a larger paper than I knew I would need in the end here because I wanted to see what would give me the best effect, and I found that tilting the ink spot forward so that just one edge of the ink spot hits the paper really worked the best. So once I had my page all done, it was time to cut it down. I cut the wood grain panel down to be just a little bit smaller than the card because remember we want that sand piece to peek through. So I cut this down to 4 1/4 by 3 inches, and then I'm going to tear the edges to get that ripply effect. Now when you're tearing paper, you can pay attention to which direction you tear it. If you tear the paper in one direction, it's going to give you one kind of finish on the edge, and if you tear it the other way, it'll give you more of a rough finish. So I was testing my paper here, and I want more of a rough edge, so that showed me that I need to tear my paper toward me. So I just tore that out, and then when I glued it down, I pulled on those edges a little bit, kind of rolled them up because I wanted them to look just a little bit rougher. Now it's time to work on the palm tree. So for that, I'm using the Dino Days stamp set and the coordinating Dino dies. I'm going to be using the leaf die for the palm branches, and I'm not going to be using the ones that I stamped on. I'm going to do a different effect with the leaves, and I'm also going to be using the trunk of the tree there. So to start with, I'm using the trunk of the tree, and I'm going to do what's called a kissing technique. I know that the images that came in the kit had an awful lot of texture to it, so I'm taking one of my texture stamps from the Artisan Textures stamp set, and after I have inked up my trunk with crumb cake ink, I'm taking an uninked stamp and I am just going to press it on that ink stamp. And what that's going to do is my texture stamp is going to lift some of that ink off and give a little bit more texture to my tree trunk. So then I'm going to take these palm branches that I have die cut out, and I'm going to use that same texture stamp. I'm going to use my old olive ink, and I'm going to stamp off once, and then I'm going to stamp onto these palm branches to give them a little bit more texture. Once I have my branches all stamped, it's time to assemble my palm tree. Now, I should have brought this down a little bit lower on my card. I wasn't quite sure the size the palm tree was going to end up, but I just placed all of these on, and I used some dimensionals on a few of the leaves to give them a little bit more dimension and lift, and to just give my palm tree a little bit more character. I used the Coastal Cabana ink to stamp my sentiment onto a piece I had cut using the stitched rectangle dies. Then it was just a matter of playing around with my elements until I got them the way that I liked them. I used some linen thread to tie a bow, and I added that to my card with a glue dot. I am going to be doing this on all the cards, just like the cards that came in the kit. And that finishes off card number 1. For card number 2, I'm working on the next palm tree scene, and we're going to do some watercoloring for this. So I have cut a panel that is slightly larger than my card base, and I did this because sometimes when you're watercoloring on the edges, the color can pool up a little bit, and I want to be able to trim that off if that happens. So I am using my grid paper to line this up, and I'm using full back stickies to make a mask across my paper. I'm using my grids to make sure that I have a straight line all the way across. And these post-it notes, because they're full back, will also work as kind of an adhesive to help hold my watercolor paper down while I am watercoloring. We're going to do a wet on wet technique for this watercoloring. So I am getting my brush, and I am going to just run it across my watercolor paper with water. And then I am going to grab my balmy blue, and I'm squishing that up into the top of my ink pad so that I can use that as a palette. And I am getting my brush wet, and I'm just getting a little bit of color, and I am just really making wispy motions so that it looks a little bit more like a sky. And then to speed up the drying, I'm using my heat tool. If you have the Stampin' Up! Heat tool, then use the low setting for this. That is exactly what it's intended for. So then once this is dry, I'm going to grab my sticky notes and move them up to the top of my page so that I can work on the bottom part, which is the water. So I'm going to do the same with my Coastal Cabana ink and make myself a little palette up there in the lid. I'm going to add some water to the paper, and then I am going to slowly add color on here and give myself a wispy effect again. Now with this one, once I had everything on, I sprinkled a little bit of water on the surface with a paintbrush and went over that with a dry rag just to lift a little bit of that color up to give myself a little bit more of a wavy feel. Now, what I should have done at this point is went ahead and added this panel to my card base and trimmed it down, but I wasn't thinking, and I moved ahead and worked on the sand, and I did the same effect for the sand here that I did on the previous card. So I did some first and second generation stamping with crumb cake ink on crumb cake paper, and then I cut little waves on this to give it more of a sandy, beachy horizon kind of look. And then I added that up with dimensionals and cut it down. And then I put it on my card base. At this point, I wanted to work on my palm trees. Now, the really cool thing about photopolymer stamps is that you can bend them and shape them. So there were 2 palm trees on the card that came in the kit, and they were facing different directions. So I bent my stamp to get it leaning just how I wanted for each of the palm trees. And I also did the kissing technique again with these palm trees. So this was a really fun way to kind of make my palm trees do what I wanted them to do. And then I just used my scissors to cut them out. Once I had these cut out, I cut them down and positioned them on my card the way that I liked them. And then for this card, I did not add texture onto the palm leaves. I just used my die cut to cut out those green palm branches, and I left them plain this time and just played with them and got the positioning just as I wanted. I also did not use any dimensionals on this one. I wanted to see how that would look, and I just positioned those leaves so that they're all coming from the very center of that palm tree. And then I cut them down so that there were none hanging over the edge of my card. I again used the stitch rectangle dies to make my sentiment strip, and for this one I used some leftover of that wood grain paper that I made earlier, and I stamped my sentiment in Coastal Cabana. I used a stamp from the Here's a Card stamp set that says, I made you a card because you're worth it. I really love these sentiments that come in that set. The rectangle piece ended up being a little bit too long, so I just lined up my die and ran it through the die cut machine again to cut that extra little square off. That way I would still have the stitching and it would look just like I had intended it to be that size in the first place. So then I am just going to add my elements to this card. I futzed around with it a little bit, and I decided to cut the coral up into a few pieces. That way I could position it a little bit better the way that I wanted it. And I got everything on my card, added my bow, and that was it for card number 2. Card number 3 had a beautiful watercolor background and a detailed vellum die cut. For the die cut element, you could probably use something like a doily. I don't have one. So I am using the stitched lace background die, and I'm using one of my circles from the layering circles dies, and I ran them through my Big Shot to get this kind of lacy circle. Then we're going to use the same watercolor wash technique. So I'm adding water all over my piece of watercolor paper, and then I'm starting with Coastal Cabana at the top and Old Olive at the bottom. So I'm going to concentrate most of my Coastal Cabana color at the bottom, and then as I work up, that's going to get lighter. And then I'm going to do the same thing from the top with my Old Olive. So I'm going to start with my more concentrated color at the top, and then kind of let that fade out into the Coastal Cabana at the bottom. Now I also wanted to do a little bit of watercolor lifting on this one. So I used a clean brush with nothing on it, and I did a few swipes across the paper to kind of lift some of that color up, and then I used a clean dry rag to kind of take that color off a little bit. Once this was dry, I started to add my vellum piece, but I stopped because I realized I hadn't cut this down for my card base yet. It's a little bit larger like the one I did before, and if I centered my vellum piece before I cut it down, it might not end up in the center when I'm done. So I went ahead and added this to my card base and trimmed it down, and then I just put a few dots of glue across the center of this because I know that will be covered by my sentiment, and I glued that down. I used another one of those rectangle stitched dies to cut on the wood grain paper that we made for my sentiment again, and I picked another sentiment from the Here's a Card stamp set that says thanks, and I stamped that in Coastal Cabana ink. And then it was just a matter of playing with the elements again and lining them up to get them just where I wanted them. Once I got those down and got them all lined up and popped my bow on, I left the tails long for this one, my card was finished. So that's all there was for card number 3. Card number 4 was the sandy beach with the ocean waves beside it, and I had the most fun recreating this card. It was definitely my favorite of the 4 to make. And to recreate it, I started with a light pool party blend marker, and I colored this on the bottom, the front of the card. And I was not going for full coverage, streaks were fine. My whole goal was just to kind of get color all across that bottom panel there. And then I took my Coastal Cabana ink and a sponge, and I sponged the Coastal Cabana over top of the pool party, and I felt like this gave a very similar look to what was in the kit. For the top part, I cut down a panel that was 3 1/4 by 4 1/4 inches. So it was smaller than the card base. And then from that piece, I made kind of the wavy shoreline with my scissors. And then I did the same thing with my light crumb cake blend, and I used my brush tip and I just laid color down all over. Now I really wanted it to be a little bit streaky, so I did quick fast motions and I went over places again and again, and then I used my crumb cake ink and another sponge and I sponged all over that as well. And then I went ahead and I sponged the edges of that shoreline as well with the crumb cake ink, and I glued that on top of my card base. For my sentiment with this card, I used one that says "The world needs more of you" from the Free as a Bird stamp set. And I just cut a little piece of that wood grain paper out again and stamped in Coastal Cabana on that. And I decided to go ahead and fishtail the edges just a little bit. I got that. I noticed that all of my sentiments were rectangle and the ones in the kit had a little bit of fishtailing on them, so I decided I would go ahead and bring that in. And then it was really just a matter of adding my other elements on. I popped my sentiment up on dimensionals and I decided to add that coral colored vellum coral that I made earlier to add a little bit more color to the card. And I added linen thread bow on top, and I left the tails a little bit long on this one as well. And that was all for card number 4. Thanks so much for joining me as we made these 4 cards inspired by the June 2019 paper pumpkin kit, A Little Smile. I would love to see the creations you came up with, as well as hear the ways that you are spreading your small cards around to bring smile and joy to others. I want to invite you to check out my website. I have an exclusive tutorial there on how to make this adorable little box that you can carry your cards in. I didn't add it into this video because it was already so long, but if you're interested in that, check the link in the description and it'll take you straight to the blog post that has that exclusive video there. I also wanted to let you know that it is not too late to sign up for the July Paper Pumpkin Kit, which will make 9 excellent masculine cards, 3 each of 3 designs, and it will have exclusive products that coordinate with the Come Sail Away suite, the Garden Lane suite, and the Woven Threads suite. So if you're interested in any of those suites, this might be a great kit for you to check out. You just have a couple days to make sure that you're signed up for that. I will leave all the links you would need in the description box below. Again, thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you again either on Facebook, here on YouTube, or over on my blog for more card making inspiration. And I hope that you have a fantastic day and that you find joy in creating as you spread kindness and encouragement with your scraps of paper. I'll talk to you later. Bye.